Plassey to Partition and After. A History of Modern India. Second edition of the 18th century. 1.1. DOTMA. Founded by Zahiruddin Babur in 1526 and expanded to its full glory by Emperor Akbar in the second half of the 16th century, the Mughal Empire began to decline rapidly since the reign of its last great ruler Aurangzeb 1658-1707. Even in the first half of the 17th century, its capital Delhi was considered to be the major power center in the entire Eastern Hemisphere, but within 50 years the signs of decline of this mighty empire were unmistakably visible. Some historians ascribe Aurangzeb's divisive policies for this rapid decline, particularly blamed are his religious policies, which alienated the Hindus who constituted the majority of the subject population. His expansionist military campaigns in western India against the two autonomous states of Bijapur and Golconda and against the Marathas are also believed to have sapped the vitality of the empire. But some other historians believe that the roots of Mughal decline lay in institutions and systems intrinsic to Mughal administration, rather than in personalities or specific policies. There is, however, less dispute about the fact that the process of decline had set in during the time of Aurangzeb and that it could not be arrested by his weak successors. The situation was further worsened by recurrent wars of succession. The Mughal army was weakened, allegedly because of a lamentable dearth of able commanders. There was no military reform and no new technology. This weakening of the Mughal military power encouraged internal rebellions and invited foreign invasions. The Marathas under Shivaji had time and again challenged Aurangzeb's imperial rule. After his death the Maratha plunders increased. In 1738 they plundered even the suburbs of Delhi. This was followed by the Persian invasion under Nadir Shah in 173,839 and the sack of Delhi, which was a tremendous blow to the prestige of the empire. A brief recovery followed and the first Afghan invasion in 1748 was repelled. But the Afghans under Ahmad Shah Abdali again struck back, took over Punjab and sacked Delhi in 1756-57. To repel the Afghans, the Mughals sought help from the Marathas, but the latter were also defeated by Abdali at the Battle of Panipat in 1761. The Afghan menace did not last long, because a revolt in the army forced Abdali to retire to Afghanistan. But the political situation in North India certainly signified the passing of the glorious days of Mughal Empire. Earlier historians like Sir J.N. Sarkar 1932-50 believed that it was a crisis of personality. Weak emperors and incompetent commanders were responsible for this downfall of the mighty Mughal Empire. But then, other historians like T.G.P. Spear 1973 have pointed out that there was no dearth of able personalities in 18th century India. It was indeed a period marked by the activities of such able politicians and generals as the Saeed brothers, Nizam-ul-Mulk, Abdus Samad Khan, Zakaria Khan, Sadat Khan, Saftayu, Murshid Quli Khan or Savai Jaya Singh. But unfortunately, all these able statesmen were preoccupied more in self-aggrandizement and had little concern for the fate of the empire. So at times of crises, they could not provide leadership and even directly contributed to the process of decline. But this need not be considered as personal failures, as it was more due to the weaknesses inherent in the Mughal institutions, which had evolved gradually in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Mughal Empire has been described as a war state in its core. 1. It sought to develop a centralized administrative system, whose vitality depended ultimately on its military power. The emperor stood at the apex of this structure, his authority resting primarily on his military might. Below him the other most important element in this structure was the military aristocracy. In the late 16th century, Akbar had organized this aristocracy through his Mansabdari system, which meant a military organization of the aristocracy, its basis primarily being personal loyalty to the emperor. Every aristocrat was called a Mansabdar, with a dual numerical rank, Jat and Sawar, Jat signifying his personal rank and Sawar the number of horsemen he was required to maintain. This dual numerical rank also indicated the position of a particular nobleman in the overall Mughal bureaucracy. Sometimes they were paid in cash Nakdi Mansabdar, but most often they were paid in the form of a Jagir or landed estate, the estimated revenue income, Jama, of which would cover his personal salary and the maintenance allowance for his soldiers and horses. There were two types of Jagir, transferable or Tankha Jagir and non-transferable or Watan Jagir. Most of the Jagirs were transferable. The non-transferable Jagirs were only a device to incorporate the locally powerful Rajas and Zamindars into the Mughal system, by proclaiming their autonomous chieftains their Watan Jagirs. Appointment, promotion or dismissal of Mansabdars and allocation or transfer of Jagirs were done only by the emperor, and so the members of the aristocracy only had personal loyalty to the emperor himself. Any form of impersonal loyalty, national, ethnic or religious, could not develop in Mughal India, and so the entire imperial edifice stood on a patron-client relationship existing between the emperor and the ruling class. 2. The effectiveness and the permanence of this relationship depended on the personal qualities of the emperor and the constant expansion of resources, which explains the constant drive towards territorial conquests in Mughal India. But there were no more conquests since the late years of Aurangzeb, and this was supposedly followed by a period of constant shrinkage of the resources of the empire. This is what ruptured, as some historians argue, the functional relationship between the emperor and the aristocracy, on which depended the efficiency of the imperial administration. To understand how this diminishing loyalty of the aristocrats could affect the Mughal Empire, a close look at the composition of this ruling class is called for. Lineage or ethnic background was the single most important factor in matters of appointment as mansabdars. A great majority of the Mughal nobles were outsiders who had come from various parts of Central Asia. But they were gradually Indianized, although this Indianization took place without any coherent policy of the empire. The aristocracy was therefore divided into various ethno-religious groups, the most powerful among them being the Turani and the Irani groups. Those who came from the Turkish-speaking regions of Central Asia were called the Turanis, while those who came from the Persian-speaking regions of present-day Iran, Afghanistan and Iraq were called the Iranis. The Turanis were Sunnis and the Iranis were Shias, which lent a religious color to their mutual animosity and jealousy. Though the Mughals belonged to the Turani ethnic lineage, they did not show any personal favor to the Turanis. The other groups among the nobility were the Afghans, Sheikh Jadas or the Indian Muslims and the Hindus. The latter group mainly consisted of the Rajputs and Marathas, whose incorporation was because of specific political needs of the empire. After Aurangzeb conquered the two Deccani kingdoms of Bijapur 1685 and Golconda 1689, the noblemen who were in the employ of those two kingdoms were absorbed into the Mughal aristocracy and they came to form what is known as the Deccani group. It was primarily during the last years of Aurangzeb, due to the incorporation of the Maratha and Deccani nobles, that the composition of the Mughal aristocracy underwent a dramatic change, which brought to the surface the latent contradictions within its ranks. 3. The mutual rivalry and competition among these groups of nobles, as it is argued by some historians, came to a head supposedly because of an 18th century economic crisis. About 4/5 of the land revenue income of the Mughal Empire was under the control of the mansabdars, but this income was very unevenly distributed. In the middle of the 17th century, out of about 8,000 mansabdars, only 445 controlled 61% of the revenue income of the empire. 4. This naturally created jealousy and tension within the aristocracy, particularly when the resources of the empire were stagnant or even diminishing. This economic situation, known as the Jagirdari crisis of the 18th century, has been defined by Sekher Chandra in the following words: the available social surplus was insufficient to defray the cost of administration, pay for wars of one type or another and to give the ruling class a standard of life in keeping with its expectations. 5. This happened because of the unusual increase in the number of mansabdars at a time when the area to be distributed as Jagir or Pabaki remained stagnant or even declined. Revenue collection, particularly in the south, fell far short of the estimated income, diminishing in turn the real income of the Jagirdars in disturbed areas. To make matters worse, there was a continuous price rise since the late 17th century, as the supply of luxury goods flowed towards the European markets, putting the Mughal aristocracy in further distress. 6. As too many mansabdars were now chasing too few Jagirs, many of them had to remain Jagirless for years, and even when a Jagir was assigned, there was no guarantee that they would not be transferred within a short period. The entire aristocracy, therefore, suffered from a tremendous sense of personal insecurity. This Jagir crisis was not, however, a new phenomenon, as there had always been gaps between collection of revenue and the estimated revenue income of a particular Jagir. The crisis increased during the last years of Aurangzeb, mainly because of the Deccan Wars. There was now a rise in the number of mansabdars and the political turmoil made the collection of revenue a more difficult task. J.F. Pritchard's 1975 has argued that the problem was to some extent artificial and due to wrong policies of Aurangzeb, who was constantly expanding the size of the royal land or Khalisa. There was a 23% revenue increase after the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda. But instead of distributing this extra income among his mansabdars, Aurangzeb wanted to use these resources to finance his Deccan campaign. So the newly conquered lands were incorporated into the royal Khalisa land, its revenue income going directly into the imperial treasury to meet the salary demands of the soldiers fighting in the south. An opportunity to solve the Jagirdari crisis was thus lost, and therefore Richards thinks that this crisis was artificial and not due to any real scarcity of resources. He has shown, however, that revenue collections in the Deccan were gradually falling, while Sekher Chandra argues that Deccan always was a deficit area. So, it is difficult to say conclusively how the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda would have really solved the Jagir problem. But whether artificial or real, the Jagir crisis is believed to have led to an unhealthy competition among the nobles in order to have control over good Jagirs. Group politics at the Mughal court became an order of the day, each group wanting to have influence over the emperor to get access to good Jagirs. After the death of Bahadur Shah in 1712, the problem reached crisis proportions, as now the low-ranking officials found it real hard to maintain their lifestyle with what they got from their Jagirs, as revenue collection became increasingly difficult. The problem intensified further during the reigns of Jahandar Shah 1712-13 and Farrukhsiyar 1713-19. It did not improve at all during the reign of Muhammad Shah 1719-48, when mansabdari ranks were distributed indiscriminately for political reasons, leading to further inflation in the numbers of aristocrats. To meet their increasing demands, portions of Khalisa land were converted into Jagir. This measure could not fully solve the problems of the mansabdars, but impoverished the emperor. Nizam-ul-Mulk, after becoming Wazir Prime Minister, tried to solve the problem through a redistribution of land. But he could not follow it through, because of strong opposition from within the court. 7. Politicking at the imperial court was at its height during this time. More generally, the Mughal nobility was divided into three warring factions: the Irani group led by Asad Khan and his son Julfikar Khan, the Durrani group led by Ghazi-ud-Din Khan, Firoz Jung and his son Chinkulich Khan, Nizam-ul-Mulk, and the Hindustani group led by the Said brothers, Khan-i-Doran, some Afghan leaders and some Hindus. These factions were not organized around ethnicity or religion, but more on family ties, personal friendship and above all selfish interests. This faction fighting never went beyond the imperial court, nor lapsed into violent confrontations. No one questioned the divine right of the Timurids to rule, but every group tried to extend their influence over the emperors to control the distribution of patronage. Proximity of any particular group to the center of power naturally alienated the others, and this gradually affected the personal bonds of loyalty between the emperor and his noblemen, as disaffected groups found no reason to espouse the cause of the empire. And what was worse, this resulted in corruption in the army. No Mansabdar maintained the required number of soldiers and horses, and there was no effective supervision either. This weakening of the army was fatal for the empire, as ultimately the stability of the empire depended on its military might. That the Mughal army was no longer invincible was successfully shown by the Maratha leader Shivaji. This decline of the army became more palpable, as there was no fresh technological input or organizational innovation. The nobles now were more interested in carving out autonomous or semi-autonomous principalities for themselves, which resulted in a virtual fragmentation of the empire. Map 1. The Mughal Empire in 1707. Recurring peasant revolts in the late 17th and the early 18th. Centuries are also believed to have been a major cause of the decline of the Mughal map. Politicking at the imperial court. This decline of the army became more palpable, as there was no fresh technological input or organizational innovation. Map 1. The Mughal Empire in 1707. Recurring peasant revolts in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries are also believed to have been a major cause of the decline of the Mughal Empire, and it is not unlikely that the crisis of the ruling elites had something to do with them. An empire imposed from above and its gradually increasing economic pressures were perhaps never fully accepted by the rural society, and the regional sentiments against a centralized power had also been there. Peasant unrest was therefore a recurrent theme in the history of the Mughal state ever since its inception. But fear of the Mughal army always acted as a deterrent and prevented the problem from blowing out of proportion. In the late 17th to 18th centuries, as the weaknesses of the central power became apparent and the Mughal army faced successive debacles, and at the same time the oppression of the Mughal ruling class increased, resistance to imperial authority also became widespread and more resolute. In most cases, these rebellions were led by the disaffected local zamindars and backed fully by the oppressed peasantry. Eventually the combined pressure of the zamindars and peasants often proved to be too much for the Mughal authority to withstand. These revolts can be interpreted in various ways. They can be portrayed as political assertion of regional and communitarian identities against an intruding centralizing power, or as reactions against the bigoted religious policies of Aurangzeb. The latter interpretation seems to be more unlikely, as in the later part of his reign, Aurangzeb was showing more liberalism towards the non-believers and in fact wooing many of the Hindu local chieftains in a cool calculating mood to win their loyalty and solve the political problems of the empire by isolating his enemies. 8. But the real reasons behind these revolts, as some historians argue on the other hand, could be found in the property relations of the Mughal Empire. Whether or not the emperor was the owner of all lands in his empire is a debatable issue, but he certainly had an unquestionable right over the income of the land which was collected in the form of land revenue, the amount of which was gradually increasing since the Sultani period. Irfan Habib 1963 has shown that the Mughal land revenue system rested on a compromise. The peasant was left with sufficient provision for subsistence, while the surplus, as far as possible, was extracted by the state in the form of land revenue. It is not true that the Mughal peasant was left with no surplus at all. For continuing production, he was certainly left with some, while differentiation within the peasantry also indicates that. But on the whole, although larger peasants could withstand the pressure, the smaller peasantry increasingly felt oppressed. 9. Usually in the Zabd areas where a detailed land survey was undertaken, the revenue demand was 1/3 of the produce, but the actual amount varied from region to region. In some areas it was half of the produce, and in fertile regions like Gujarat it was as high as 3/4. Part of it, collected from the Khalisa land, went to the imperial treasury, while the larger portion, 80% in Aurangzeb's time, went to the Jagirdars. Below the demand of the state and above that of the peasants, there was another kind of demand on the income of the land, and that was the demand of the local landlords or zamindars. There was differentiation among the zamindars. Some of them, like the Rajput chiefs of Rajasthan, were fairly big Rajas with considerable local political power. They were incorporated into the Mughal bureaucracy, as in return for a fixed payment peshkash and loyalty to the emperor, their autonomous power over their own territory or watan was recognized. At the bottom were the Malgujari or primary zamindars, who had an independent right over the land, and in many cases it was through them that revenue was collected from the peasants and in return they got nankar or revenue-free land. Between these two groups were the intermediary zamindars who collected revenue from their own zamindari as well from other primary zamindars. Below the zamindars were the peasants who were also differentiated. The khudkists were peasants with occupancy rights, while the pahikists were vagrant peasants. There were close community relations based on caste, clan and religion between the primary zamindars and the peasants. This was an important source of power for the zamindars, many of whom controlled small armies and forts. The Mughal administration in the interior could not therefore function without their active cooperation. Akbar had tried to turn the zamindars into collaborators, but from the late years of Aurangzeb, particularly after the War of Succession 1707-8 following his death, the loyalty of the zamindars definitely began to flounder. 11 In the Deccan, towards the last years of Bahadur Shah's reign, all the zamindars, both primary and intermediary, turned against the Mughal state with the active support of the hard-pressed peasantry. 12. One major reason for the open defiance of the local landlords might have been the increasing oppression of the Jagirdars. The earlier emperors tried to keep them in check through a system of rotation. Irfan Habib 1963 has argued that because of this Mughal system, and by taking advantage of it, the Jagirdars oppressed the peasantry. As they were frequently transferred, they did not develop any attachment or any long-term interest in the estate, and tried to exact as much as possible during their short tenures, without any consideration for the peasants. Their natural oppressive propensities remained within certain limits only because of constant imperial supervision, but the supervisory system totally collapsed in the 18th century. The overmighty nobles who could resist or defy transfer, developed local power bases and by using that tried to extract as much as possible. This trend was quite visible in Golconda after its subjugation. 13 Later, in the last years of Bahadur Shah's reign, a number of Jagirdars in the Deccan made compromises with the Maratha Sardars chiefs, and that arrangement allowed them to collect as much as possible from the peasantry. Sometimes they collected advances from the army's revenue officials, who in turn extorted as much as they could from the peasants. 14 On the other hand, those who were more frequently transferred found the local conditions too turbulent for the collection of revenue. To solve this problem and to squeeze maximum benefit within a short period, they devised the Ijaradari system, through which revenue collecting right was farmed out to the highest bidder. The revenue farmer's demand was often much higher than the actual revenue demand, and the pressures ultimately moved downward to the primary zamindars and the peasants. During the time of Farrukhsia's reign, even Khalisar lands were being given over to the Ijardars. The Mughal compromise is believed to have completely broken down as a result, and the primary zamindars began to defy the Mughal state for their own share of the surplus. In the outlying and more disturbed areas, such as Deccan, zamindari defiance became an order of the day. Even in the heart of Mughal North India in the 18th century, there was a widespread tendency among the zamindars to defy the central authority, withhold revenue payment and to resist the Mughal state when it forcibly tried to collect it. 15 Because of their community ties with the peasants, they could easily mobilize them against the Mughal power. For the peasants also, the zamindari initiative solved the problem of leadership, as they often found it difficult to challenge on their own a centralized authority and continue their struggle for a very long time. The peasant grievances in late Mughal period were, therefore, often organized around religious and regional identities. The Maratha Sardars took advantage of the peasant grievances. The Jat peasants were mobilized in North India by their zamindars. The Sikhs rose in revolt in Punjab, and the Rajput chiefs withdrew their allegiance in Rajasthan. All these revolts led to the formation of autonomous kingdoms in different parts of the empire, further attenuating the authority of the Mughals. The 18th century thus witnessed the rise of a variety of regional states, some of which built on older local or regional traditions of state formation, others focused on ethnic identity and associated notions of community. 16 By the end of the century, effective rule of the Mughal emperor was confined only to a narrow stretch around the capital city of Delhi. In 1858, when the English deposed the last emperor Bahadur Shah II, they only ended the fiction of his imperium. To some historians, however, poverty and economic pressure do not seem to be a wholly adequate explanation for these rebellions and the eventual decline of the Mughal state, since there had been significant regional variations in local economies. The recent revisionist literature, therefore, wants us to move away from the centrist view and to look at the situation from a different perspective, the perspective of the periphery. The Mughal decline, according to this new history, is the result of the rise of new groups into economic and political power and the inability of a distant and weakened center to control them any longer. In the entire history of Mughal Empire, there is more evidence of prosperity and growth than of decline and crisis. There is no denying that even in the 18th century there had been regions with surplus resources, like for example, Moradabad Bareilly, Awadh and Banaras, but the Mughal state could not appropriate this surplus. And the resources accumulated in the hands of local zamindars. 17. Bengal was another surplus area. In eastern Bengal, vast stretches of forest land was being reclaimed around this time, and the settlers of these new areas gave distinct religious and political orientation to their newly established agrarian communities, while the provincial officials could easily carve out for themselves new revenue units around these agrarian settlements. 18. The rising agricultural production in some areas and monetization of the economy, in other words, made available more resources at the disposal of the zamindars and peasants, and powerful local lineages, who gained distinctly greater advantage and confidence vis-a-vis the imperial center. 19. Taking advantage of a weakening central control, they now found it more convenient to repudiate their allegiance to a centralized imperial power and assert their autonomy, while still maintaining the cultural and ideological framework of the Mughal state. Possibilities for such diffusion of power had always been there in Mughal India, it has been argued. There were corporate groups and social classes who enjoyed, despite a supposedly obtrusive central authority, various kinds of rights that constituted, in C.A. Bailey's terminology, their portfolio capital, which they could invest to reap huge profits. 20. According to this school of history, throughout the Mughal period there had been a constant process of reconciliation and adjustment between the central power and the regional elite. Mughal sovereignty, as Andrew Wink has argued, rested on a balancing system of continually shifting rivalries and alliances. The Mughal system was repaired to accommodate fitna or sedition, and always tried to incorporate the ascendant localized powers, either indigenous or foreign, into its concept of universal dominion, and on the effective functioning of this mechanism of conciliation and coercion depended its continued existence. 21. The Mughal process of centralization, in other words, left enough space for the continued existence of rival principles of organization. Frank Pullen, in this context, has talked about the existence of a library of categories and techniques, implying a multiplicity of systems of governance, methods of measurement and techniques of collecting revenue, varying widely in space and time. There was multiplicity of rights, like the concept of watan in the Deccan, which meant heritable rights that could not be taken away even by kings. Attempts at centralization could not eliminate those rights in the 18th century. 22. So, as Muzaffar Alam sums up the situation, around this time, because of decentralization and commercialization, a group of upstarts had come to monopolize the resources of the empire at the exclusion of the hereditary Mughal nobility or the Khanazads. 23. These upstarts were the new regional power elite who rose to prominence in the provinces and successfully contested the centralizing tendency of the Mughal state. This group included the Jagirdars who defied transfer and thus became local rulers, and the revenue farmers or the new entrepreneurs in revenue, who combined military power with expertise in managing cash and local trade. 24. Consistent economic growth and prosperity, rather than poverty and crisis, thus provided the context of the local political turmoil. 25. The Mughal system, in other words, had always left a space for the rise of powerful regional groups, and significant economic and social changes in the 18th century brought that possibility into sharper focus. But then these new developments were not properly recognized or accommodated within the system, and hence its eventual demise. It is difficult to arrive at a convenient middle ground between the conventional and revisionist histories, nor is it easy to dismiss either of them. The revisionist history has been taken to task for underestimating the cohesiveness of the Mughal Empire and for ignoring the contemporary Muslim concepts of centralized sovereignty. These critics, on the other hand, have been assailed for clinging on to a mindset that is accustomed to look at the Mughal Empire only as a centralized structure. 26. If there is any shared ground at all, as Athar Ali admits in his critique of the revisionist historiography, it is in the common recognition of the fact that the zamindars or the intermediary classes constituted a centrifugal force in the Mughal structure. 27. We may, however, conclude by saying that the idea of decline is perhaps an inadequate theme for understanding the 18th century in Indian history. The Mughal system continued even long after the de facto demise of the empire, which was followed by the emergence of a number of regional powers. The 18th century in Indian history is not a dark age, nor an age of overall decline. The decline of one pan-Indian empire was followed by the rise of another, the intervening period being dominated by a variety of powerful regional states. This century should, therefore, be considered, as Satish Chandra 1991 has argued, as a distinct chronological whole. 1.2. A.